Après, on commence.
Ok.
Et comme ça, on aura assez.
Ok.
However we can. In that sense, this Geneva Trade Week is a microcosm of everything we hope to achieve. The unfortunate cancellation of the WTO Public Forum this year left a void. We saw that need, we marshaled our resources, and we went about trying to meet it in the most innovative and diverse way we could. Like in all of our endeavors, we went out and we found partners who could try to help, and I hope we can do so going forward. We are profoundly grateful to our supporting partners, the Graduate Institute of Geneva, the UK Department of International Trade, Mr. Sergei Popov, the Geneva Chamber of Commerce, and of course Conrad Adenauer Foundation. Without their generous support, this week couldn't have happened. We're also really grateful to our thematic partners, IISD, Cato Trade, Global Trade Alert, and Bertelsmann really helped us out with their expertise and their energy around the themes of rebooting WTO and sustainability. And finally, but not least, I want to thank our inclusivity partners, the Enhanced Integrated Framework and the Trade Experts Network. They were able to help us broaden the breadth of participation and reach of this conference well beyond our network. And I wouldn't hesitate to recommend it to any conference organizer as a way of really helping hit home beyond one's local bubble. With that gratitude dispensed, I'll just wrap up with two requests and get out of the way, as that's the Geneva Trade Platform way. We provide the space and then we get out of the way. My first request is for your engagement. There are interactive elements to every single session. There are networking events throughout the week. There are book talks. There are Ask the Expert sessions. And you can discuss any of our comments on our Beyond Trade network. But ultimately, all we can do is provide the tools. It's up to you to pick them up and wave them at us. So please do get engaged. After all, the void we're trying to fill here is a WTO public forum. It's about bringing you to Geneva as much as it is bringing the Geneva trade community to you. Second, I would request your patience. The team that put the majority of this together didn't exist 2.5 months ago, and barring COVID restrictions, could fit into one Uber home at 2:30 a.m. When their day ended, as it has for the last couple of weeks. It's 2020. Things are absolutely going to go wrong this week. We will fix what we can as quickly as we can. I apologize in advance for anything we can't, and we will just beg your indulgence and your patience. We will try as hard as we can to make things go smoothly, but nothing else has gone smoothly this year, and I don't think this is going to be the first. Thirdly and finally, an introduction. It is my honor and privilege to wish you an interesting and engaging Geneva Trade Week, and to introduce and give the floor to the permanent representative of Switzerland to the World Trade Organization, Ambassador Didier Champeret. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you, Dmitry. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to welcome you all today to the Geneva Trade Week. And let me also congratulate the Geneva Trade Platform for the remarkable work undertaken in organizing this event in this very difficult and exceptional time. We are indeed most grateful to the platform team and wish to welcome its freshly appointed Executive Director Dmitry Rozlubinsky, who has already addressed this audience. Ladies and gentlemen, international trade cooperation is at a critical point, facing a number of challenges and probably also a number of opportunities. Deep new challenges have emerged as geopolitical, geo-economic, technical, and trade realities are shifting. However, the extent and implications of current and future changes are yet to be fully understood. Furthermore, emerging opportunities are still to be better redefined. We also know that these developments call for a response from the multilateral trading system. I am therefore especially delighted that there are so many today in this room and online to participate in the Geneva Trade Week. Your enthusiasm to share your thoughts during the upcoming 5 days is inspiring. Together, we will navigate the program through 5 main dimensions, namely, rethinking trade, sustainability, rebooting the WTO, trade and, which will address transversal issues, and finally, digital trade. This is a tall order. More than 200 speakers and 70 organizations will contribute actively to the debates. More than 2,200 participants have registered to follow discussions, which testifies to the importance and relevance of this event. During this week, we need to foster fresh and innovative thinking to identify realistic and concrete proposals or solutions. I started my address by outlining the leading role played by the Geneva Trade Platform in the organization of this event. Many of you may not have heard about the newly born Geneva Trade Platform. So let me give you a brief introduction. Almost 2 years back, Geneva-based stakeholders agreed that more could be achieved in order to foster policy, research and dialogue in the trade sector. They also agreed that a trade platform could respond to several needs not properly covered by existing actors or partnerships. The idea of creating the Geneva Trade Platform was in the air. The Center for Trade and Economic Integration of the Geneva Graduate Institute gave shape to this idea. They prepared a blueprint for a platform intended to promote join-up thinking on trade policy making and to offer a neutral forum to address topical issues among diverse stakeholders. Switzerland has contributed with seed funding, and we are very happy that the Geneva Trade Platform is up and running now. In fact, the Geneva Trade Platform is your platform. I hope it will prove useful to all of you to advance reflections on trade issues, and I'm also confident that you will find ways to engage actively in the platform's activities and that the platform will further develop through new partnerships and projects. Reflection on trade cooperation and the future of the WTO shall continue beyond this important Geneva Trade Week. We also hope that the Geneva Trade Platform will promote cooperation among other Geneva-based key players specialized in relevant areas such as the environment, the internet, intellectual property, health, and economic development. Finally, I wish to take this opportunity to inform you that the WTO will commemorate its 25th anniversary on the 19th of November. The Vice President of the Swiss Confederation, Federal Councillor Guy Parmelin, will deliver a keynote speech on this occasion. I now hand over to Professor Joost Pavlin, a Strategic Director at the Graduate Institute's Center for Trade and Integration, and who also is the moderator of the week's very first session, which is devoted to rethinking trade. Joost, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Dimitri. Welcome, everyone here present and online. I'm very excited to be moderating our opening plenary with one person here physically with us, Hamid Mamdou, and 4 other speakers online joining us. As the Ambassador mentioned, the Geneva Trade Week will deal with 5 different themes, and the plenary will deal with the first one, rethinking trade. I think it's appropriate because we want to ask the basic questions. Basic questions such as, why is it that businesses trade? Because before we forget, it's businesses, private sector, who is doing the trading. What and when should public policymakers, public authorities promote trade or restrict trade? And if there is to be an international trading system, what should be the goals and the guiding principles of that system? So we'll have 5 panelists to tackle these questions. And as I said, we will do this as the opening plenary because before we think about rebooting the WTO or sustainability or digital trade or the trade and agenda, I think it's really important to go back to the basics and ask the fundamental questions. So we'll have with us to discuss these issues Alan Wolf, who is the Deputy Director General of the WTO, Marian Janssen, who is the newly appointed Director of Trade and Agriculture at the OECD. We have Denis Redonnet with us from Brussels, who's the first EU Chief Trade Officer, EU Chief Trade Enforcement Officer, and from Singapore with us, Loch Nhi Su, who's a law professor at the Singapore Management School. And finally, as I mentioned already, Hamid Mamdou, who is a senior counsel with King & Spalding, and also ran recently to become the new Director General of the WTO. Now, we've discussed our plenary a bit internally, and I have a couple of questions. But before I get there, I want to just highlight the importance of the main themes we want to discuss. And I'd like to put on the table 3 reports or 3 recent think pieces on our topic. The first one is, you may have seen it, Bob Lighthizer, US trade representative, in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, came out talking about the goals of trade and what the goals of a trading system should be. And he heavily criticized the fixation with economic efficiency that many trade policymakers have, arguing that economic efficiency alone has led to disruption, job losses, has led to a COVID-19 crisis where, based on economic efficiency, supply chains may not have been adequate. He also questioned the second main objective that many people refer to when they think about, okay, why trade? And that is the idea that economic interdependence will create peace. He was saying that, at times, a scramble for raw materials or more economic interdependence can actually lead to friction and even to war. So that's one piece where basically the fundamentals of economic efficiency and trade to foster peace were questioned. The second piece I wanted to put on the table is an interview and scholarship by Danny Roderick, who recently heavily criticized what trade agreements include, saying that if you look at trade agreements today, what is in there is anything but liberalizing trade. It's more about a shift or redistribution of wealth from corporations, multinationals, to from workers and from the society at large to corporations and multinational industries, when he is then referring to something like IP protection, investor-state dispute settlement. And he asks the question, which I think is fascinating: what if we would build an international trading system that has as its goal to deal with pandemics or to foster public health or to deal with climate change? So a completely different look at what the trading system could be aiming at. Last piece I want to put on the table: the UK and the US are currently negotiating a trade agreement, and the UK came out with data saying that if this trade agreement gets concluded, over the long term, over 15 years, it may contribute something between 0.07% and 0.16% to GDP growth, looking at UK GDP. Now, that, I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer, and first of all, I wonder how they can even calculate the benefits of a trade agreement before it's concluded. But to look at the relatively minor benefits of trade agreements makes you think of, is it really worth the effort going through all of that political negotiation, political cost? Of course, another way of looking at a trade agreement would be, or of looking at the WTO, would be to say it's not so much about liberalizing trade, it's more about offering stabilization to trade relations so that we don't have trade wars. So I wanted to kind of tease our audience, our speakers, with these three different views out there on the goals of trade and the goals, the principles of, what should a trading system pursue. Now, I'll turn to the speakers now. We only have about 60 minutes that I want to share amongst all five of them, because I want to keep at least 15 minutes available for Q&A. So in the room, if you have questions, online, if you have questions, you can start sharing them in the chat so we can go through them at the end. Now, my first question goes to all of our speakers, and I'd like to know from all of them whether you have seen any shifts in debates, the discourse about trade, and the discourse about why we should promote trade. Or what is it that an international trading system should pursue? What should be the goals of the WTO of a trading system? And I stress this question because Alan Wolf, of course, is recently appointed as kind of the head of the WTO now with other DDGs. Marion has just moved to the OECD, where a different set of stakeholders are there. Denis has been promoted to the EU Chief Trade Enforcement Officer. Lockney comes to us from Singapore, different continent altogether. And Hamid has just gone through what must have been a grueling set of debates, interviews, in a run for the new DG at the WTO. So have you sensed any change in perception as to the goals of the trading system, as to why we should be promoting trade? And to kind of give a little bonus to Hamid, who is physically with us, I will give Hamid the floor first, and then go through our speakers as they are listed on the program. So Alan, Marion, Denis, and ending with Lockney. I want to stress, as discussed, I will be brutal on this, but please stick to 2 or 3 minutes for your initial responses to my question. Thank you. Hamid, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Joost, and thank you, Dimitri, for the introduction. And let me just congratulate you for this effort that comes at a very critical time on a very important subject and policy area that a lot of policymakers and political leaders around the world are trying to get their minds around. The answer to your question, Joost, is that I have not detected a fundamental shift in terms of the objectives, the purpose behind promoting trade. Trade, all the benefits that you will find in the preamble of the Marrakesh Agreement are still there. I think what governments and policymakers are struggling with is how to achieve those goals. Because over the past 20 years, there has been lots of changes. And the WTO has not really updated its rules, its function. Actually, that's another conversation, which is not the subject of your question now, but not really. Trade is terribly important, and the purpose of the WTO is still there. And I think what is needed now is just to revive the common sense of purpose of why we have this system, which is, as you said, it's about stability and predictability of trade conditions. Because if we want trade to grow, it's not going to grow with uncertainty. And that relates to a number of other economic enablers, such as investment and such as creating jobs. So it is not about how much liberalization we've achieved, although that is terribly important, but it's also about how much predictability and stability and enforceability of rules that we have achieved. And that is of tremendous value. I would look at, as an example, the African continent, and I see that the increasing realization of the importance of trade have led to the conclusion of the Continental African Free Trade Area. But what policymakers around the world, I think, need to do is just pay more attention to how trade can grow. It cannot grow just by trade agreements. There needs to be a set of enabling factors in place for trade to grow, starting with supply capacity to sound trade facilitating regulation to connectivity. And I think if you look at Africa, for example, connectivity is a huge problem, both physical and digital. If you're going to export from East Africa to West Africa through Europe, that's not going to be a very competitive export model. So all that takes us to a place where we say, okay, we need different kinds of conversation. And let me stop with that. Thank you.
Wonderfully brief as well. Can I now turn to Alan Wolf? Because I've seen a couple of speeches that Ambassador Wolf has given recently about, going back to those fundamental questions. So I'm really keen to hear what he has to say to my first question of any change in discourse, different talk happening in different places of the world about why do we want to promote trade? Alan?
Thank you very much, Joost. And thank you for the Graduate Institute for hosting this week and for inviting me to participate and others from the WTO to participate. We live in a very strange time of alternative reality. Alternative, we're virtually here, some of us, instead of being in the same room. This event is an alternative to the normal WTO public forum. We have Joost Paulin, appointed as an eminent juridical person to an alternative dispute settlement system on the interim basis. The U.S. has coined the phrase alternative facts. And we have an alternative universe in which globalization is deemed by all too many to be the major problem of this era. And that technological change is somehow never cited as the major problem for many industries. But if you have a smartphone, it eliminated a whole variety of industries and created others. So we're in a time of turmoil. And I think that has changed attitudes. There is a difference in the United States in polling data between those who are older and those who are younger. Those who are younger adapted to the technological change. They think free trade is very good. But on the whole, the populace is a very, very slim majority in favor of free trade. So the benefits, as many have said, the benefits of trade are diffuse, and the impact that can be disruptive is concentrated. I think we do a relatively poor job of stating that the purpose of the system is fairness, not only trade liberalization, but fairness. That's what the rules provide. If you are a worker in a factory and you produce something very competitively, and your company wants to market in the world, it will be able to get its goods across borders. If you're a farmer, same thing. You can ship any place in the world. In the case of services, applications for smartphones and other devices, you have an opportunity to have the world as a market. The rules are to be enforceable. That's vitally important. And the system has to be responsive to current needs. It has to be responsive to the digital economy. It has to be responsive to the environmental concerns that exist in major part today. It was not true in 1995 to the same degree. It has to be responsive on matters of competition policy, and market forces, not government fiat, have to determine competitive outcomes. So what are we faced with? Crop failures in some places, increasingly, and we have to move agriculture from places of surplus to places of deficit. We need full transparency. We need to meet full development needs. We have to lower the costs of moving something across a border, which are far greater in most cases than tariffs. When an industry is harmed by trade, when the result is workers becoming unemployed, there has to be policy space to provide targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary relief, not just for COVID-19, but for the mechanisms that allow for smoothing the adjustment. So I think the objectives have shifted a bit. They're still, as Hamid has said, pretty much on target to open the world, but it's the way we express what we're doing, and some of the things we do have to adjust, I think, to something of a new reality. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alan. So you may have noticed that our speakers, although they do not represent entire continents, obviously they come from different places. And Hamid already mentioned what's happening in Africa with the negotiations there. I think Alan made an interesting reference to perhaps generational differences. I want to turn now to Denis, who, of course, is actually working for the EU Commission, and we can get a more of a European perspective. Again, I repeat the question. In Europe, or in your experience talking to stakeholders, Denis, have you sensed a change when it comes to why trade or not trade, and what should be the goal of the system? Denis, please.
Sure. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Jos, for having me today. Just to say before I respond directly to your question that it's very good that you're allowing the global trade community to have that kind of conversation. It's more needed than ever in times of stress, in our view. And by the way, from a more self-serving European perspective, this event is very useful because we are undertaking a review of EU trade policy at the moment. And obviously, we need to listen not just to the stakeholder community at home, but also the global trade community more broadly. But you're asking me for perhaps a more European perspective. And it's true that my job is, in a large part, to be attentive and responsive to our stakeholder community. And there, I think I would say the following: in Europe and perhaps in other jurisdictions as well, the case for open markets with rules has to be made constantly. There are issues of legitimacy and acceptability around trade and around trade opening. And I think issues which have to do with a sense of fairness, to echo what Alan was saying, but also other considerations. I think issues of relating to sustainability are becoming very important in that global trade conversation. And it's true that this is not a new issue. I mean, we've had questions relating to legitimacy and acceptability simply because of the way in which trade operates, because of the distributional effects of trade, or again, to pick up a term I think Alan has used earlier, the disruption that trade can create. I think, from my perspective, there are probably three good reasons to rethink and revisit the big questions, as you say, about the why right now. I think they have to do with the fact that, as we see it, there is a shock, there is an erosion, and there is potentially an aspiration that is not quite met. The shock, evidently, it's what's happening with the COVID crisis. And I don't mean the immediate impact of the great lockdown, but also the longer lasting effects that still have to be fully measured about what the economic crisis will bring in respect to the international trading system, asymmetric recovery, perhaps more calls for protection and certainly precaution, and the question of the increase of government intervention in the economy in many jurisdictions, which obviously creates a question about interaction with the system. Second is what I call the erosion, and there it's a deeper, more structural weakening, at least, of the rules-based multilateral trading system with the WTO at its core, and it remains for us the absolute indispensable baseline that needs to be shored up. And there I don't need to go into great detail, but we've seen increasingly protectionism, mercantilism, temptation towards economic nationalism or unilateral action, power-based relations, and weaponization of trade, as well as the deeper, more fundamental problems linked to the fact that there are still some fundamentally unresolved level playing field issues inside the system, which are weighing on the international trading system. So it's not just a question of relevance for us of the international trading system. It's really a question now of making sure the system doesn't go into reverse. And finally, an aspiration, which, as I indicated, is that the international trading system, certainly from a European perspective, trade arrangement must contribute to global public goods in terms of sustainability, in particular the fight against climate change. And there probably there is a delta in terms of the agenda inside the international trading system and the WTO going forward, but perhaps we'll come to that later. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting, the different perspectives. I want to turn to Marion now, knowing that, of course, Marion is originally from Germany, but has worked for international organizations, WTO, ILO, and has just moved to the OECD, and has also worked at the ITC as a chief economist. But I wanted to hear from Marion, because I know you've been very close and looking at, for example, SMEs and at agriculture, perhaps a different set of stakeholders you meet, and whether you have heard any change in terms of why should we trade, what should the system do for us? Marion.
And thanks, Joost, and thanks for inviting me today. When I received your question about what has changed over time, I started to think of, well, for how long have I been in this system? And indeed, what has changed? And I started my career in 1999 at the World Trade Organization, just a few weeks before the Seattle ministerial meeting of the WTO. Some of you may remember that was a rather traumatic type of event where there were a lot of demonstrations, sometimes violent, against the WTO. And I asked myself, what was society expecting from the trading system at the time? What were they expecting and not getting? And the kind of things that society was complaining against was the labor outcomes of globalization. And I'm on purpose using vague expressions here. Labor conditions were not as they were expecting. More generally, the balance between what capital gets and what other parts of society get was not right. The environmental outcomes were not satisfactory, and the developmental outcomes were not considered satisfactory. I think what this reflects is maybe in line with what Mr. Lighthizer argues, that people are not just expecting efficiency. There's something else they were expecting. Now, 4 issues on the agenda. Where are we 20 years later? Unions are still not happy about working conditions. The balance between capital and labor, or capital and others, is, if anything, worse, as Mr. Roderick also appears to have suggested. The environmental debate has been sharpened, is still a very important issue on the agenda, but has not been addressed satisfactorily. So no, the discussion hasn't changed. What has changed is that civil society doesn't seem to expect a trading system to solve these issues anymore. Around 10 years ago, I heard somebody say at another ministerial of the WTO, we have become so irrelevant that nobody is even demonstrating against us anymore. So 3 important issues still on the agenda, maybe not being considered an issue for the trade agenda anymore by the society. What about the 4th point? The developmental outcomes have, in some quarters, had dramatically positive effects. And here I'm thinking of China. In these 20 years, one actor has grown a lot. GDP per capita increased, poverty rates decreased dramatically, and most of us would agree that trade had something to do with it. So does this lead to us being happy about the multilateral trading system? Not sure. You in your introduction, used the term, this has led to strategic competition. We have heard apparently Mr. Lighthizer say, maybe we have a scramble for resources now. So the one clear success of the trading system has created a new type of problems. So this sounds to me as if we don't only have to rethink trade, we have to rethink it rapidly, and we have to redo the trading system, and we have to move fast.
Okay, thank you. I already see many different trends. So listening to Hamid and Alan, perhaps more continuity. I hear some urgency in Marion's remarks, and Denis is clearly referring to a major shock and new thinking in the EU. I want to turn finally to Lockney and see what you are thinking on my first question. Of course, Lockney comes to us as a legal scholar, but based in Singapore. So Lockney, you have the floor.
Thank you, Joost, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to join this very illustrious panel. Joost, for your question, I think I would like to share first 2 observations as to what I've seen in our region. I think our region, I can't speak for all of Asia, obviously, but these are just impressionistic remarks. The first remark is that I think Asia remains very much interested in trade. For the reason that it's brought a lot of benefits, I think, to many countries in Asia and lifted a lot of people out of poverty. So that is a very much of interest still. But I do detect also anxiety in different parts of Asia, perhaps, over the future opportunities and potential for trade going forward, especially in light of this pandemic, with shifting supply chain movements and so on. So there is a sense of anxiety as to how to be relevant, how to fit in, how to take advantage of opportunities that might be arising. The second observation I wanted to share is that there's also an exacerbation, I think, of the digital divide because of the restrictions that are upon us due to the pandemic. So already within Asia, I think, within Southeast Asia, let me just say more narrowly in my own region, there was already a digital divide in various parts of Asia. So with this pandemic, the educational systems being the best example, you see that people are falling behind in their education, the opportunities to get online may be different in different parts of Asia. So that naturally translates into 2 aspects. Firstly, in terms of actual trade, information and flow, and secondly, in terms of education of people who potentially would be able to trade or take part in the value chains that we're going to be looking at. Then I turn to, I think, 2 points, hopefully, that will bring some optimism to this first answer I have for you, Joost. Firstly, I'm glad that Mr. Hamid earlier mentioned the preambles, because I actually had prepared 1 slide, but I can't show it now. But in my slide, I had done a little reading on the preamble, the language in, for example, the GATT and the GATS. And for those who are not familiar with the WTO agreements who are listening in, the preambles are the opening words in a treaty, setting out the goals and aspirations of the treaty parties. So which my students wrongly say is blah, blah. So I correct them immediately and I say, that's not blah, blah. It's very important language. So why I'm referring back to the preambles of these important agreements that have been signed by so many countries is they actually struck me as containing a lot of the aspirations and goals already expressed by the previous panelists as to what people really are looking for. So for example, there are words like income, employment, economic growth, multilateral negotiations, and mutually advantageous arrangements. So to me, these are all words that are already existing in the agreements, which direct the WTO parties and trading countries to look at these issues and not just focus on rulemaking. Rules are, of course, important. As someone who's trained in the law, we understand the significance of rules, but also the aspirations that drove the parties to sign on to certain rules are equally important, I think. And the second point, hopefully for optimism, is that the language of the agreement that established the WTO refers to multilateral negotiations as being one of its functions. And it doesn't say that multilateral negotiations must only be confined to making rules, legal rules. It could be multilateral negotiations which help, for example, SMEs in some way. So I will elaborate a little bit more with examples later, but I just wanted to put out that teaser at this moment to say that, yes, there is a platform available among the countries in the WTO or the members of the WTO to actually negotiate creatively. And I'll leave it at that for now.
And thank you for engaging in such a brief fashion with my, fundamental question. So I've picked up many different things. Some people saying it's changing, others saying it remains the same, or it remains the same and the WTO is becoming irrelevant, as Marion was saying, if it doesn't act quickly. But a couple of objectives that I've heard repeatedly, of course, liberalization, perhaps still creating gains, economic efficiency at some level. Hamid threw in predictability, stability. I think Alan stressed quite a bit fairness. And Denis, from the European perspective, added the idea of serving global public goods, in particular sustainability. Now, Lockney reminds us that many of these objectives are already in the preamble, but I want to turn to my second question, and knowing that there may be changes in the air and that different places, different people may think radically differently about the system and what trade should be achieving. Do the panelists here really think it's feasible to come to a new consensus on what the system should be striving for? I mean, there's so much diversity if you follow the press between the US and China, between Europe and the US even, so much tension, not just on trade, but technology, IP, and so much political polarization between countries and within countries, that you can ask yourself, what is the lowest common denominator? What is it that 164 nations can agree on as this is what our system needs to push for? Now, on a more optimistic note, if you look at, for example, what's happening in the US, a lot of people are saying, well, irrespective of whether President Trump is reelected or we have a Biden administration, on trade, there seems to be, or there may be, a bipartisan consensus. I mean, look at the USMCA, it was adopted by a huge majority. Similarly, in Europe, and I'm sure Denis can refer to that, as a Belgian, I always grew up thinking you have within the EU different fractions, and the French on one side, the Dutch on the other side when it comes to trade. But if you see that the French and the Dutch are now submitting proposals on EU trade reforms, pushing for a level playing field, you may think perhaps there is a way to find consensus between otherwise very diverse perspectives. So can I push my panelists on this issue? We've already heard amongst you a diversity of goals, objectives. Do you think that the membership can find a consensus or a new consensus of what the system should be striving for? And I'll perhaps go through the same order as people have spoken before. Hamid.
Thank you so much. Let me start by clarifying a little bit the differences between what has changed, what hasn't, because I would make a distinction between the why, the what, and the how. The why we're here and why we trade and why do we have the system, I don't think that has changed. It's the same aspirations. The what we try to achieve, if you put it in broad terms, there's a lot of agreement on updating the rules, also pursuing liberalization, sort of the broad what we want to achieve is still there. There may be some sort of diversity on the what that needs to be reconciled. But when it comes to the how, this is where I believe that fundamental changes need to take place. Because when you put the question, Joost, about do we need a new consensus, I would go back and ask the question, okay, we need to find out what was wrong with the first consensus first before we move on. We need a bit of a diagnostic view of why we are where we are today. Why? And my view, and this is only my view, is that we have a system that was created like a tripod with the three pillars, dispute settlement negotiations and the deliberative function with the transparency and monitoring and everything. And those three pillars were designed to operate with balance. It's like a tripod. But what we've seen over the past 20 years is that two of those pillars have broken down. And that led to the unsustainable imbalance where dispute settlement was gaining strength because of the inherent automaticity in the procedures, but that was not sustainable and led to problems with the third pillar as well. So we need to have the political vision to look at the system and how it was put together and what do we need now in order to, first of all, realize why we are in this situation, and therefore what do we need to change? And here I would see that there's a need to revive the negotiating function, which is for the system is the legislative function. It's like any legal system. You can't have a strong judiciary and a failing legislative. What we ended up with is a hugely outdated book of rules. Not only that, but of course, what the preamble of different agreements, including the Marrakesh Agreement itself, call for, which is the mutually advantageous outcomes of negotiations. When the trading powers shift, the balance needs to be readdressed. And in the absence of negotiations, you don't have any of that. So what you end up with really over the years is a backlog of grievances that lead to that breakdown. So I would make that distinction between the why, the what, and the how, and focus in terms of what needs to change on the how we do things.
Thank you. Alan, can I give you the floor again on, is there hope for a potential new consensus on what all 164 could agree on is the aim of the system, or are you more pessimistic than I was trying to hint at?
Optimism is in store. I greatly I'm in favor of improving the existing system, certainly not scrapping it. I think probably there's agreement on the panel of that. The central question is, all the members agree that they're very much in favor of multilateralism. Do they have enough in common, enough common interest to improve the current system? And I believe that each of them does, without exception. None have left the system. 23 are in the wings seeking entry into it. What are the irreducible common elements? One is every member has to believe that trade can be good for its people. This is probably a little bit not in line with Danny Roderick, but I don't think the members are in line with Danny Roderick. That market forces will determine competitive outcomes. I'm not talking here about the degree of government ownership. I'm talking about whether when a company sells, when an individual sells, whether market forces will determine the success or failure of that transaction, same when they buy. So I think those two conditions are gating conditions. They're necessary to the operation of the system. And I believe they do have, that is the common interest of the system. Last week, the G20 trade ministers met and the Riyadh initiative was put forward. And the chairman's summary is that they all agree to the rule of law, transparency, non-discrimination, inclusiveness, fair competition, market openness, resistance to protectionism, and a degree of special and differential treatment for developing countries in reciprocal and mutually advantageous arrangements. So the G20, which is pretty representative of a lot of different types of economies, is in agreement on a lot. What was left out? There are some obvious omissions that clear actually from the text of the chair's statement. Binding dispute settlement, not in that list. Need for market-oriented policies, not in that list. Sustainable development, not in that list. Rule by lockstep consensus, not in that list. So in thinking about the Riyadh initiative when it was being considered, I came up with 19 values the WTO had. I won't list them all. I've listed them in prior speeches, but there's a lot that goes into not only the preambles, the Marrakesh Declaration, the Marrakesh Agreement, the GATT, the ITO, but what can be derived from looking through the agreements. And you see that there are quite a lot of common values. So a new consensus, not exactly. I think there will be multiple. I looked up, apparently there's no consensus on what the plural is of consensus. You could call them consensi. That's one alternative. But I would just say areas of consensus, AOCs. The areas of consensus allow for incremental change to occur, and they're occurring. The joint initiatives coming out of the Buenos Aires Ministerial Conference number 11 in December of 2017 is an area of consensus. It doesn't include 164. It includes most of world trade, a very high percentage of world trade in each of these joint initiatives on e-commerce, on investment facilitation, on small and medium enterprises, on domestic regulation of services. What could go beyond that as areas of consensus? Expansion of the information technology agreement, updating and expansion of the coverage of the pharmaceutical agreement, which the EU has been working on in the Ottawa Group. Consensus on environmental goods and services is more important now than it ever was. A consensus on women's empowerment, a new working group was just established. So I think there's a lot that is areas of consensus, not a single overall consensus for everything. And we have to deal with this form of diversity. As long as the arrangements add to and don't subtract from what has been achieved on a fully multilateral basis. There are areas that will have to be multilateral. I don't think domestic industrial subsidies or domestic support in agriculture lend themselves to bilateral, regional, or anything less than multilateral agreement. So there's a need for some agreements to be all-inclusive. For the areas of consensus, they have to be open to all to join. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. A long list and really, really interesting ideas. So the question is there scope for a new consensus of goals amongst what is now a universal organization? Denis, can I turn to you?
Sure. Well, just before I get there, in a way, as policymakers, we have to deal with working on two consensus, or search for work towards two consensuses at the same time, because there's the consensus across countries, but there's also the consensus within countries about trade policies. And you need to do both in parallel. But here you're focusing on the question of the consensus across, so between countries. And there, I think, my 2 minutes worth on this is that, I mean, on the one hand, I think we believe that it starts by shoring up the fundamental principles, and some of them are very simple but very powerful principles that underpin the system that we have. And there I am with Hamid in saying that these fundamental principles, were legal principles, are the core and must be reconfirmed. MFN, non-discrimination, transparency, predictability, binding through proper enforcement. In our view, means a binding two-step dispute settlement system in the WTO. Now, this is indeed something which I think the international community is engaging on. Alan referred to the G20 Riyadh initiative, that's exactly how we see this exercise. It is a way to take a step back and see what is the common basis that we have, then further engage the next step, which is going to be the reform of the system. Do we have a shared understanding about what the foundational principles are? Some of them, indeed, to be found in the existing texts of the WTO, notably, as Lochner was mentioning, the preamble, which, even though it is written in a slightly dated manner, does contain these elements of preoccupation across the membership of the WTO. But beyond that, it's evident to us too that probably the system, in order to find a new consensus, needs to fill some gaps that are there, that leave some unresolved level playing field concerns across the membership, or if you want to put it other ways, where there has not been yet a fully negotiated, agreed sense of what the boundaries of the exercise of comparative advantage is in the system. And this is necessary because that is what probably then enables the system, a single unitary system, a global trading system, to absorb and to limit, to mitigate the trade spillover effects of different policies, economic models, levels of development under the same roof. And I emphasize that the role of the system is not so much to pronounce on respective economic systems or approaches, but to deal with the spillover effects associated with the divergences. In order to do that, and I'll finish with this for now, our view, and this is something we've started to express now for 2 to 3 years, that we probably need to consider an effort at fairly fundamental reform of the WTO, indeed across, as Hamid was saying, the 3 pillars or the 3 functions. One cannot be dealt in isolation from the other. So perhaps I'll leave it there for now as well.
Thank you. Interesting that two of you referred to the G20. I want to turn to Marion now and see, even within the OECD, do you get the sense that there's a new consensus emerging, or what's your take on that? My second question.
Well, I will also make reference to the G20. I think, agree with a lot of what has been said by the previous speakers. There is definitely some type of consensus, and we have seen that in the G20 under the Riyadh initiative. So there is consensus around terms like transparency, non-discrimination, fair competition, market openness, resistance to protectionism, and rule of law. I would like to highlight that, however, these consensus themes, they all refer to the efficiency role of trade, so not to the potential other objectives. I would also be a bit less optimistic as to whether we are in a position to implement this type of consensus. Yes, we agree that there should be fair competition, but we seem to interpret across countries in a different way what this means. And we do not know yet what the future rules would look like to ensure fair competition. This theme of fair competition is related to several of the other terms that have come up. Do market forces determine outcomes, as Alan Wolf said? State-owned enterprises, subsidies, state aid. All these issues are linked and determine whether we consider that competition is fair. At OECD, we have an active work program on this theme. We run this under the theme level playing field, and we hope to contribute to concrete answers that will help us to implement, to make work this theme, this concept that many member countries of the WTO appear to agree on. So yes, there's some type of agreement in the field of efficiency. Not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily the case that everybody agrees on how these consensus themes will be implemented.
Thank you. Can I turn now to Lochnie on to hear her view on whether there's a new consensus is even feasible? Lochnie?
Yes. Actually, I'd like to answer with maybe 3 observations on this idea of consensus. My sense is there's some kind of consensus emerging already that some kind of reform is required. So I think that's the first step that most people that I've talked to or that I've read publications of seem to point in that direction, that yes, we do need reform. So that's the first point. The second point is in relation to the values, or you call them common denominator, that previous panelists have referred to, for example, transparency, rule of law, good governance. All these are reflected in various agreements outside of the WTO, and I haven't made reference to the G20 statement, but a lot of it overlaps. So I think there could be ground for picking up on all these values that we see in these various statements, initiatives, and agreements, quite apart from what we see in the WTO agreements themselves. Now, the third point is, I think that the point was made earlier by another panelist, that by DDG Wolf, that the members have stayed in the WTO. So to me, there's an implicit signal that there's a consensus that it wants, the membership probably wants the WTO to remain relevant or be relevant. So in that light, I think that the question for me is how to conduct the modalities of the conversation on reform. That's a difficult issue, because if we do have an agreement that we need change, how do we have that conversation? How do we organize it? How do we broker it? That is, to me, a significant challenge, which can be overcome, I think, but it needs to be addressed perhaps in terms of methodology. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And that's a good segue into the third and final question I wanted to put to you. But we've gone from, has there been a change in why we trade or why we want to promote trade, to seeing whether there's a common denominator, new consensus. The third question, and I really want to push the panelists a bit here to get concrete, to get real, to get very practical. If there is a new or old consensus on what we should be doing, can you give 1 or 2 very specific examples of what needs to be done differently, or what you would put in the system, or what kind of a rule or reform you would push for? And as Lochnie was saying, how he would actually move things forward to get there. Because if I may just remind you of what we got out of my second question, I think it was really interesting that we need to be clear that the new consensus always needs to include the idea that you only join a trade agreement if it's in your own interest. I think Alan made that point. Many people refer to the G20 statements. I think Marion pointed out that may be, a bit of lip service at some level, because what does it really mean, how to implement this? But what I also took away is what Hamid and Lochnie were saying. If anything, there's a consensus on a need for reform, right? The last point, and I heard it from Denis and Marion, is this move towards questioning what is comparative advantage, as opposed to perhaps distortions that we shouldn't live with. So this new term of leveling the playing field, and what should be accepted as comparative advantage, and what is the line between things that become distortions? Because it does go to the point, and I'm not sure whether in today's context everyone sees it this way. Is the WTO really putting market forces first, and what does that mean? So perhaps I can turn the order around, if I may, and push all 5 of you, because we have about 8 minutes left, very concretely, very concisely. Give me one thing that you would change or do differently, and how would you get there? Lochnie, if I may start with you.
Yes, sure. I think one aspect, and is to me very practical, relates to some research that I did about 2 years ago in my region on Southeast Asian challenges for micro, small, and medium enterprises, or MSMEs. There are many, many MSMEs in Southeast Asia, and one of the challenges for them is how to get connected to the global value chain. Some of them may be in villages, some of them may be in towns and cities or on islands. in Southeast Asia, for example. And instead of what we often hear as the last mile problem, for them is the first mile problem. They can't even connect to the outside world easily with their goods to find a market and so on. So pursuant to that research that I did a little paper which made a sort of proposal, and I can share that later with anyone who's interested, to actually suggest that in the trading system, perhaps we have all these great organizations and people and the rules that undergird the system, for example, the people represented in this meeting, to bring together people who do trade negotiations, to do technology, creation of apps and logistics parties and so on, to knit it all together and have the trade system basically connect such small businesses and allow them to join global value chains in a constructive manner. And that's what I meant as in multilateral negotiations don't necessarily always have to create rules. They can create interesting collaborative platforms and networks and interesting connections. And the trade rules that we have could serve to facilitate, like trade facilitation agreement can facilitate movement of all these goods through the system into the global value chain. So I do feel that that's one example that's relevant to my region, which could bring, I think, the significance of trade rules directly to smaller players and let them see that it works for them. It could work for them.
Thank you. Marion, can you offer us your one concrete proposal? Marion?
Well, I did already mention one. It's the level playing field work, where the OECD is very active, not because I or my predecessor decided this, but because our members asked for this. Another point, it's related, is the one of the trade and investment nexus. That's one we consider very important. It's not going to solve all the issues, but it is related to many of the issues we mentioned that have been mentioned in this discussion. First, companies who are the ones who trade, you mentioned that yours, take trade and investment decisions together. Therefore, our policies have to look at these two fields together. Thinking goes already in this direction. At the G20, we're not having a trade working group, but a trade and investment working group. What we do at the OECD is to work towards a taxonomy of understanding how investment issues have been and can be integrated into comprehensive agreements, looking at both issues together. I believe that this can address some of the level playing field of fair competition, market force issues that have been raised before. I believe also that this addresses some of the concerns civil society may have about the interlinkages between the financial world and the real economy.
Thank you. Denis, your one proposal, concrete?
Yeah, I think from our point of view, we think that we've come to a point where we would like the membership to basically work on three parallel substantive agendas in terms of WTO reform. Let me just sketch them, but can I just make one micro point? Because I really like what Lochni said earlier about moving from a consensus about the need for reform to a consensus about the modalities. There, we also think the modalities matter a lot. In particular, let's not confuse the aims and the tools of the system. And number two, let's try as a membership of the WTO to use all the inbuilt flexibilities in the system. In our view, this is going to be very important in getting WTO reform done. Three parallel agendas, I think, for me, would be to, number one, complete what is an ongoing facilitation agenda in services, investment, digital trade, which is an agenda which has a great potential for the reduction in trade costs. Number two, it's to tackle now more meaningfully a level playing field agenda to address the spillover effects of a number of industrial policies. And number three, it's to develop a sustainability agenda. And there we see space for the WTO and the WTO membership to look at the questions of health and pandemics on one hand and climate change mitigation on the other. So this would be my proposal for the action forward.
Thank you. Can I turn to Ambassador Wolf now for your kind of course, you don't have to give your complete list, but a concrete proposal of something that could push this new consensus or push things forward. Alan?
Yeah, I'd say what we have to do is repair Hamid's tripod. I mean, the purpose of the organization is to negotiate agreements. We haven't done a lot of that in the last 25 years, some, but not a lot. Settle disputes, and we have problems there, which are well known, and administer. How do you administer this multilateral trading system? So specifics. Agree on where unanimity is to be applied and what it means. That you cannot block the exploration of new issues. That we have to have a new interpretation of the application of consensus. We have to get back to a single form of dispute settlement that is accountable to members. And it's in that accountability that I think lies the secret of getting through the mess to a single unitary system that's subscribed to and considered legitimate by all. And third, governance. Get a new director general. What is the new director general expected to do? Hamid is eloquent on that subject and will be in the future, I think. What should the secretariat be doing? Is it going to be strong, proactive? And how do the members govern themselves? What's the role of a committee chair? So, and then there's the procedural point of actually getting down to creating a mechanism that moves forward on the broad reforms that have been discussed. I think we need a conservative form of revolution, something like the United States had over 2 centuries ago. Disruptions create opportunities. We've described a number of disruptive, and in your opening use, you talked about a number of the disruptions that are out there. Now we have to have forward motion. It can be incremental. It can be more comprehensive, more systemic, but we need to address the issues that the panelists have put on the table. I think change is coming. I think it's going to be evolution and that it's irresistible. So there will be a new consensus. It will be formed with a series of smaller areas of consensus, but the next step must not be deferred.
Hamid, can we end with you? Your view on or your concrete suggestions, please.
Thank you. There are lots of elements that were mentioned about specific negotiating items and about systemic reforms, but I would not add, because there's a lot there. But what I would say is that there needs perhaps in this sort of approach to be a distinction between the specific negotiating items, whether it's e-commerce, domestic regulation, and the list goes on, and the systemic problems that need to be resolved and for which different kinds of discussions would need to take place, such as plurilateral processes, open plurilaterals. Why do we need consensus to launch any of those? A conversation needs to take place and clarify what the rules say and make it less politicized. We also need to look at the negotiating items and perhaps consider putting together a balanced package of trade-offs, because if you're going to ask members to come to the table, there needs to be incentives for them to come and negotiate on any item, be it industrial subsidies or be it e-commerce or this or that. And that would require an enlightened level of self-interest, of course. But this is what the conversation should be about. And I think we are at a point now where we should not let this crisis go to waste, because this is really providing a lot of energy for going forward. But I think we need to start with having different kinds of conversation. And I agree very much with what Alan said about governance. And this is also a list of systemic issues that need to be addressed. And I know we ran out of time, but I think it's your fault, Jos, that you put a number of amazingly interesting questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I want to turn now to the audience to see whether we have some questions from people in here in the room or online. So let me also give you some preferential treatment for those of you who made the effort to come here. Any questions for our panelists? No? So people online, I will turn the mic then to Dimitri, who can read out some questions, please.
Sure, thank you, Just. We've got a question from Alta Garcia Cuevas. Do you expect the US position towards the WTO will automatically shift in case Joe Biden wins the US presidency? Or do you think some pressure over the system will still remain in order to align US expectations away from multilateralism and the multilateral system?
Now, I suggest we take perhaps a couple more if you can, Dimitri, and then I can give the floor to panelists and they can decide which question they want to respond to.
Sure. We have another question from David Wink. How important do you think sustainable development is to a new consensus? And can there be a new consensus around sustainable development? And one last question from Peter Parmentier. How do you reconcile reciprocal market access with the right for countries to develop their infant industries in a context where a country enjoys the status of a developing country in general, while it is at the same level of the advanced economies in, say, industry specifically?
Okay, if I can turn to our panelists then. So we have three questions. The first one was on what might change with the Biden administration. The second one, you really think there's a consensus on sustainable development? And then the third one was about, reciprocal market access versus infant industry. Marion, can I first turn to you to see whether you want to comment on any of these three?
Yeah, I would take the one on sustainable development, because I think it's a relatively easy one in the sense that already the G20 Riyadh initiative has shown that there doesn't seem to be a consensus around this. And as I said before, the areas of consensus seem to go in the direction of saying we have to try first to ensure that we get this WTO or the multilateral trading system to function for our efficiency objective. So that's maybe not very positive or optimistic, but we seem not to be going there, in my view, versus a consensus on sustainability.
Can I ask whether anyone wants to comment on the third question on reciprocal market access and infant industry developing countries? Anyone? Hamid, please.
Thank you. I think that fits into the broader conversation that is taking place now about special and differential treatment. And this is an example of the kind of systemic issues that I was referring to earlier when I said we need different kinds of conversations, which would be more purpose-driven and less ideologically inclined. In other words, what we need to look at is what exactly is the kind of problem that we're trying to solve. And if I may, at this point, that we've had this conversation about the treatment of developing countries in the early 90s when we were drafting the GATS, and we started with a blank page. And we ended up with a pragmatic approach to the treatment of developing countries based on customized negotiated outcomes with individual flexibilities based on each country's needs. One of the big challenges, which even we faced then, and they're much more true now, is that developing countries are not homogeneous. And any one-size-fits-all approach to the treatment of developing countries is not going to be productive. So this is an example of one conversation that we need to move to practical and pragmatic grounds and be purpose-driven and perhaps ideologically agnostic a bit. Thank you.
So that leaves us with the Trump-Biden question. I'm sure Lockney will happily answer that one. I know Alan Wolf and me are perhaps in a difficult position to do that. We academics can speak openly. Lockney, you want to have a go at that, or you feel?
No, it's okay. Definitely putting on my academic hat. I think there are two parts to what I would say to that question. Assuming in that question that the candidate Biden wins, I think those recent laws and regulations which enjoy bipartisan support are unlikely to be changed because they're bipartisan. So unless something shifts in that, I think some of these rules might be there to stay. The other aspect of the answer would be, it'll be interesting then to see whether there's a shift in the approach with respect to free trade agreements, because as you may recall, it was the Trump administration that made a decision to not participate anymore in the CPTPP FTA. So that is one spot I think people will be watching, especially in this region, should that outcome materialize, as stated in the question.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for a second round. Dimitri, can you perhaps pick 3 questions again, and then we can close our plenary?
Okay, I think we've got 3 last ones. One from Danielle Dinepi. Do you think that the increasing wealth and income inequality in the world, together with social immobilities and difficulties in intergenerational income mobility, is reshaping society and bringing a different trade perspective that perhaps betrays environmental objectives? Question 1. Second question from Daniel Crosby, one of our future panelists. If there is no consensus on the market solution, what's the alternative? And thirdly, a question from Nihal Ahmad Khan. If the entire membership cannot see enough incentive to sit down with all 164 members, shouldn't plurilaterals become the modus operandi for future pathways?
Great, thank you, Dimitri. Perhaps I can turn to those we haven't heard yet from in the Q&A. Alan Wolf, you want to pick one of the 3 questions or all 3?
Yeah, clearly income inequality is a real concern. I do point back to the Pew poll that the young are not negative. The 2/3 in favor of free trade agreements. They didn't have factory jobs, by and large, and they've adapted to the technology. So I think there's a lot of hope for the future. In fact, that the trend is going to move in the right direction. There were enormous adjustments in the last several decades as a major power, economic power, came online, as well as Asian tigers, and caused adjustment. Those adjustments have taken place. And so I think moving forward, any administration in the United States is pointed to the USMCA, the replacement for NAFTA, as having passed the Congress with a broad majority. It took into account issues of the environment, issues of labor, and I think that whatever happens in the election in the United States, that trend is going to continue. There'll be differences, I think, depending on who is elected, because there'll be a fresh look. It'll take a time. With the Obama administration, there was no immediate change for the first 2 years. So it'll take a while for a new administration, probably, if there is one, to settle in. The existing administration, you know where they are. And Lighthizer has, in recent writings in Foreign Affairs, as well as the op-ed cited at the beginning of the session, indicated what his views are, and he's pretty influential.
Great. Perhaps I can turn to Denis now. Remember, the 2 questions unaddressed are, if the system won't be based on market solutions, what's the alternative? And if it's too difficult for a consensus amongst the 164, what about plurilaterals? Denis?
Yeah. On this, I think for me, first the answer is relatively straightforward, actually. And the former Director General of the WTO, I heard him say that very explicitly, and I think we subscribe to it. Open plurilateralism, by which we mean one where the benefits are open and participation is a priori open. Open plurilateralism is a perfectly legitimate form of multilateralism. So there should not be, frankly, a debate around that question anymore. And there is an agenda ongoing to achieve results in the WTO, which is based precisely on that kind of flexibility that the system has inbuilt. The problem is not using that flexibility widely enough or assertively enough until now. But that is certainly for us the way to go. Can I just say one word maybe on the question that was raised on the question of wealth, income, inequalities, and this goes back to the question of the consensus within countries. I think is very important. And there, it's evident also that on the trade policy community side, we have to be a little bit conscious of the limitations of trade policy as a zone. Here, all this depends fundamentally on a whole suite of domestic policies. Their quality, their integration, and play a much bigger and more important role than the design of the trading system itself. So at some point, what the consensus can do across countries will not take away the need to build domestically through other means and other policies the consensus within countries.
Okay, thank you. I'm watching the clock. We are right on time. So if I can briefly sum up, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time to discuss in future panels. In terms of the goals of the system, we've heard efficiency still. The goal remains sustainability, predictability, fairness, and perhaps a generational difference as to what aspirations people have. Is there a hope for a new consensus? I leave this discussion rather optimistically. I've heard, though, the notion of areas of consensus, AOCs, although living in France, AOC to me is something different, but multiple consensus, or perhaps looking at what the G20 has recently concluded on, although that's perhaps focused too much on efficiency, some of you said, and closed plurilaterals being a way to implement these multiple fields of consistency. And then finally, on concrete things we can further debate during the week, how can we implement some of that new thinking? I've heard some changes on the operation, the operating mechanism, if you wish, in terms of Hamid's tripod, or rethinking, which I thought was very interesting, Alan saying perhaps we don't need unanimity to bring in new things in such elements as Annex 4 to the treaty. And then a long list of issues that can be developed or added to the agenda: SMEs, investment. Of course, they are already there under certain initiatives, but then level playing field, services, digital trade, sustainability agenda. So I hope this was a good way to kind of get us all excited, interested in what's to come during the rest of the week. Thank you to our 5 panelists for being so disciplined, staying to my questions and staying within your allotted time. Thank you all for being here with us in person and everyone online. I turn back now to Dimitri.
Thank you so much, Houston. Thank you for all of our panelists for an outstanding panel. In my opening remarks, I begged for your indulgence if there were technical difficulties. I then got off the stage, sat down, and was promptly informed that everything I said right up until that point hadn't come through on the video because I was still muted. I will absolutely not repeat my speech, for which I'm sure I have your eternal gratitude, but I did want to, for the record, get our thanks out there for our partners who really have made this possible. So with that, please let me thank our supporting partners, the Graduate Institute of Geneva, of course, the UK Department of International Trade, Mr. Sergei Popov, the Geneva Chamber of Commerce, and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I rehearsed pronouncing that, believe it or not, and still screwed it up. They made this week possible. We also had 4 outstanding thematic partners for our sustainability and rebooting WTO plenary specifically. That was the IISD, the Bertelsmann Foundation, Global Trade Alert at the University of St. Gallen, and Cato Trade. They provided the energy and expertise to make those themes what they are. And finally, we had 2 outstanding inclusivity partners, the Enhanced Integrated Framework and the outstanding Trade Experts Network, who really helped to broaden this conference beyond the people we happen to know and drink with and really take it out into the world. And I would have no hesitation in recommending them to any conference organizer. And with that, round 2 completed, let me once again thank our panelists. Let me welcome you all to Geneva Trade Week, as apparently you got to watch me do it as a mime act the first time. And I hope you enjoy our outstanding program. Thank you so much.
Thank you.